Alright, so I played a game recently called Vampire Regent. I recommend it, it's definitely a very solid game. It's about a vampire regent. Never would have guessed. Pretty much a prince if you're familiar with Vampire the Masquerade, and all that entails, i.e. managing a city of vampires, dealing with the rabble, and whoever threatens the blood-sucking way of life. Unlife. So I have a huge problem with false advertising. In this particular case, it's a save feature. I'm saying this first and foremost because if you're like me and you save sporadically and mess up, you'd expect a way to load back. Not the case. The game randomly deletes saves. Must have something to do with the engine because it's the first game I saw which had save, so it's a little buggy. Just back up your files. Okay, that out of the way, the story itself I really enjoyed. The part of it was rushed the last part of it was rushed badly, but up until then it does Vampire the Masquerade atmosphere really well, despite not actually being a licensed game. It's a homebrew with its own quirks and unique features, although the inspiration is fairly obvious. I specifically want to praise the fact that it's pretty much impossible to be good in this game. The player is leader of what is pretty much a criminal organization, of night-dwelling monsters who feed on humans and murder, steal, rape and deal drugs or weapons on a regular basis. Being a good guy here is impossible, but can be at least fair at best. I really enjoy this kind of bleakness. Aside from that, there is a pretty cool, if somewhat obvious, plot twist. There are two major plot points about betrayal and political scheming. This is what Vampire the Masquerade is all about, but Bloodlines had a really simple one. Coteries and Shadows of New York had it barely play out. Night Road is just a long, interesting story with no real twists. This, however, is exactly what it's supposed to be. Political blood-sucking assholes. Good stuff. Now more about the parts of the plot. The first thing is the Cloud. Yes, the Cloud. The Cloud has a lot of people in it, and as a whole, they don't have a singular goal. They have their ambitions, they have their goals, they have to work together because it's safer, not because they agree with each other. This is really spelled out with Otto, the guy who provides blood from a hospital. He has a lot of pull, but he is pretty much breaking a bunch of rules, gets special treatment from everyone, and sees himself way above the law. So when you tell him no, he wouldn't hesitate to refuse a direct order from a player, a character who is as high a rank as it gets. This is great. This asshole-style treatment is exactly what politics should be. A whole lot of people out for themselves. A really strong point. Then there's a group under the important vampires, the Initiates. They come up in the story sometimes, there's a lot of them, sometimes they are just looking to prove themselves, sometimes they are training and want guidance, and sometimes they mess up. These events offer choices on how to guide them or punish them. This was also great. It could have been a lot more simple or not even there. A technically unnecessary part of the story, but it adds a lot more character to the goons, underlings, and just not important to the story people. I would only complain that there was a moment at one point. Two Initiates were training and it went into a full-on fight. I was given a choice on how to treat them. One guy started it because he was mocked, another obviously retaliated. So I thought, let them fight. See who actually is stronger and prove that mockery is right or wrong. Well, not the best choice in hindsight, but, well, they're not good guys. Anyway, prior to this, my character dueled another important dude, Executioner Morgan, and we agreed to lethal weapons, but it ended after 3 strikes. Nobody seriously hurt. This is what I expected to happen. Not the case at all. Fight to the death was pretty much a direct quote. At no point I expected or wanted this. After which I had 4 options which amount to "don't question me, Kerr," or "it was for my amusement," and a variation of these two. Of course one died, and everyone was shook and looked at me in horror. So options can be a little inconsistent, misguided, but aside from that, it is a strong point. The relationship with advisors is another. At the beginning there are 2 advisors, then there is an option to get another one. The other one basically barely comes up though, so I'd say that was really weak. But those 2 first ones have a lot of character. The woman, Therese, reminds me a lot of Therese Warman, is a stuck-up, buttoned-down, no-nonsense woman who is all business. To contrast her, the other one is pretty much a smiling jack. Makes smarter quips, kicks ass and never really treats anything seriously. The 2 have a great contrast and play off each other really well, but they don't really do that much to the story. They are just there for good set dressing, but they don't really affect much, so I wouldn't praise it as a very strong point. Aside from that, there is also an individual relationship of a player and singular characters in the cloud, which is again nice and adds a lot more character, but again, doesn't really change anything. You get to learn what the executioner suffers from depression. His life is meaningless as he has no goal to strive toward now, and if a player beats him in a duel, he sees that as a challenge to overcome, a new goal in life. Great short story, but it doesn't really change anything. It's a great example of all of them. They come up, they're interesting to know, but the effect they have on the main story is not there. The executioner doesn't really become more capable because of it. He doesn't suddenly support the player more, tell him something about the events he overheard which might tip him off about the future. These characters are, however, not as important as advisors, yet they get spotlight now and again, so I would still praise it as a solid point. Now there are also other characters in the story, and I would like to definitely say that outlaws were a very weak point. Now of course they are supposed to be an enemy faction, however they are pretty much only coming up on the phone. They are talked about sometimes, they sometimes do something, but for the most part they just don't exist in the story. A very disappointing thing too, because I wanted to see if it was possible to mend ways with them, and maybe even join them instead of Cloud. A very weak point. And then two more characters appear from time to time. One is Russell, a very important, powerful vampire who started the game. The latter calling a meeting is what begins it all, and sets it in motion. The relationship with him is interesting on the surface. He is enigmatic and confusing. He definitely doesn't ever tell the whole truth, but he doesn't do anything bad directly. I like that kind of character. Can never know what to expect until the last possible moment. The problem is the fact that his twist was entirely obvious. Maybe less hints would have helped, maybe making him be more helpful, I'm not sure. Also, he's a very rare guest in the story, and seeing him is always a little too quick for someone this important. Second character is Rose. She appears by complete chance, and you can hang out with her by complete chance, and then by complete chance she teaches the player something important. And by complete chance can be romantically involved with. I care not for such things, romantic stuff in these is always uninteresting. Anyway, just like Russell, she barely appears, does some important things, and is there, but there's so little of her that she doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. If she was removed, nothing really would be lost, and she really isn't that interesting of a character anyway. So I would definitely say anything to do with these two is just a mediocre part of the story. Now another character who rarely pops up is the Nephilim, the vampire who commands all the other vampires, and this character is done right. Her appearance is so cheesy and cringy that it feels like someone who wrote her eating puppies and drowning kittens for fun, but felt like it wasn't vampiric or evil enough. It's a little bit funny how over the top it is. But I don't think she was important enough to the story to really count as a bad point. She was like wind. There, existing, sometimes helpful, sometimes in the way, but not doing anything to the story, just existing. The end does heavily focus on her, but it's a pretty short scene. The meat of the game is already gone by that point. It's just a silly confrontation of an obvious choice. So, she's pretty irrelevant. And the last point is the leaving people and everything to do with them. First the mayor, an extremely minor part of the story. Pops up in the beginning, sounds like it would be much more major, with vampires backing the politicians in an evil cabal like Illuminati, and instead it's pretty much there, not doing anything to the story. Again, irrelevant. The vampire hunters, on the other hand, are a major part of the story, but they don't really have any individuals except for Oswald and Jeremiah. First is a hunter who fights the player on the roof, one-on-one, but he has honor, so he throws a knife to fight on equal terms. A really interesting idea, which appears for 5 minutes and then ends. Disappointing because it was just a really cool character. Jeremiah is the exact same way. He's a loudmouth who's blackmailing the player. He's a real threat. He's dangerous, and he's the one who sets the playfield. The player has to play by his rules. And then he dies. In like 10 minutes. Yeah. The hunters are really more of a horde of monsters than vampires are. Fanatics bent on one goal and only that. Poisoning themselves just to make sure the vampires can feed. No real character except for those two who instantly disappear. Pretty weak. And hell, I've forgotten about the Crimson Riot. I think that's the right name. At one point, one of the Cloud's vampires is assaulted by the other vampires. They're supposed to be outlaws, but it's not really addressed. They encountered again in the bar, and they try to start up trouble there too. But it's neutral ground. No. But it's a neutral ground, so no real fight happened there either. The end. That's it. No more story to that. It's talked about again, but it has nothing to do with anything aside from those two events. It's completely dead plot point leading to nothing. Disappointing. And that was it. Some really strong points and some pretty weak ones, but no real horrible ones. So for the most part, a very solid story with very solid part, but kind of fizzles out at the end and ends up being okay. Not bad, not great, but okay. A solid, good okay. And even if parts of it maybe mediocre, maybe not very good, I think there's just enough to create something big and enjoyable.